Welcome, everyone. We'd like to get started. So it's my great pleasure to welcome David Held to give the robotics seminar this week. David is visiting us from Carnegie Mellon, where he's an assistant professor. David has a wonderful robotics pedigree with just some amazing experiences. He was an undergrad here. So I'm going to try to get the years right. You correct me, but I think he was SB in course 2, Mechie in 2005. SM in course 2, 2007, when he worked with Lynette Jones.
Yeah.
And then went off to industry with some interesting experiences in industry and research in Israel. Then he went to Stanford, where he was in Sebastian Thrun's lab just after the DARPA Urban Challenge. And he did his master's 2012, PhD 2016 from Stanford.
Oh, yeah.
And then a year or maybe a bit more postdocing with Peter Abil at Berkeley. So we've got MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, and here. It's wonderful to have you back here. And so looking forward to hear about your work.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you about my research on perceptual robot learning. So what is a robot? A robot typically consists of a perception system that processes sensor inputs and tries to estimate the state of the world, and a planning system that tries to take that estimated world state. Yep.
You don't need to use your mask if you don't want to.
Oh, I'll keep it on though. Thanks anyway. And a planning system that maps from the world state to actions that the robot needs to perform to complete a task. And typically, we divide up researchers the same way. We have vision researchers that work on the perception side of the problem, and robotics researchers that work on the planning side. And the question that I like to ask is, can we build a better system by thinking about these parts together? Now, to clarify, I'm not proposing that we merge perception and planning into a single end-to-end black box. I'm just proposing that we think about perception and planning jointly. Now, when I propose this idea, sometimes people ask, why can't roboticists just use the output of a computer vision method? And to answer that question, let's look at what computer vision methods typically produce. Here's an output of a typical computer vision method. The job is to detect or to segment objects in an image. So the goal of computer vision is to understand what is in an image. On the other hand, the goal of robotics is to understand what will happen if a robot interacts with its environment. So if this robot were to interact with this towel in some way, the robot will want to predict what is the effect of its actions on the object. So roboticists tend to have different goals from computer vision researchers, and thus we need to develop new perception and planning methods to meet the needs of a robot system that must both perceive and act in the world. So how do we bridge the gap between perception and planning? For example, suppose that we have this crumpled towel, and the robot wants to interact with this towel in some way to be able to fold it, flatten it, perform some other task. How should we represent this object for this task? There's different types of representations, and they have different trade-offs in terms of how easily we can infer them from observations of the environment, as well as the robot's interactions with the world, and also how suitable each representation is for a given task. So my goal is to learn to manipulate novel, perceptually challenging, and deformable objects. And I believe that this requires rethinking robot perception and planning algorithms to handle these types of objects and manipulation tasks. So what can we actually achieve with this perspective of perceptual robot learning? Here's a few examples of some recent projects in our lab. So you can see that we're doing lots of cloth manipulation, also grasping transparent and reflective objects, and pouring transparent liquids into transparent cups. Unfortunately, I'm only going to have time to talk about the first two projects today, but I'd be happy to answer questions that you might have about the other projects afterwards. OK, so I'm going to start by talking about a benchmark that we've developed for deformable object manipulation. This is a project led by my student, Xingyu Lin. So if we think about the field of computer vision has really been driven forward by large-scale image data sets, such as ImageNet or Cityscapes as some recent examples. But really, computer vision has used data sets for a long time. And data sets allow researchers to compare different algorithms to see if we're making progress on some task. And it also allows researchers to build on top of other algorithms and improve them, and then see if their improvements if their changes led to improved performance. In robotics, we don't really have data sets. The closest thing that we have is simulators. So here is an example of the famous Majoko simulator that's sometimes used by reinforcement learning researchers to measure performance on locomotion type tasks. But what about deformable object manipulation? Here's a few visualizations from recent deformable object manipulation papers. And you can see in these examples that most papers evaluate on different tasks, simulators, and robot setups. And this makes it hard to compare algorithms and see if we're making progress on the task of robot deformable object manipulation. Now, deformable object manipulation is very important. Here's a few examples of applications of deformable object manipulation, but there's many more. I'm sure you can think of other examples of deformable objects that you encounter in your lives or other applications of deformable object manipulation. Deformable object manipulation is also very challenging. A few of the challenges. First is the high dimensional state representation. So as opposed to a rigid object whose state can be compactly represented by 6D pose, for deformable objects like a cloth, it has almost an infinite number of degrees of freedom. So managing the high dimensional state representation is a challenge. Also, deformable objects have complex dynamics. And finally, deformable objects have self-occlusion. So in this view, you can only see some parts of the cloth, but there are other parts that you can't see because they're crumpled underneath the cloth. And there's some ambiguity about how they might be crumpled. So that's due to the self-occlusions. So in order to address these challenges, we built a benchmark known as SoftGym. It's built on top of the NVIDIA Flex simulator. And this benchmark has 6 different deformable object manipulation tasks, which are transporting water without spilling, pouring water from one cup to another, straightening a rope, folding a flat cloth, spreading a crumpled cloth, and flattening a cloth that you're holding in the air. And SoftGym has already actually been used by different members of the community outside of CMU. Here's 2 papers that use SoftGym that we really like. And so we encourage you to check it out as well if you're interested in deformable object manipulation. The link is at the bottom of this slide. So using this benchmark, we can also compare different algorithms on these tasks and see how well they can perform. So first, this black line is showing the performance of an oracle-based approach that assumes access to the ground truth state and the ground truth dynamics. This is information that's not typically available to a robot that's just observing an environment. We can't typically observe the ground truth state of all points in the crumpled cloth, but this provides somewhat of an upper bound of what you might expect a good algorithm to achieve. So given the ground truth state and ground truth dynamics, this algorithm does CEM planning and achieves the performance shown by the black line here. Here with the different colors, you can see the performance of different state-of-the-art deep reinforcement learning algorithms. I'm not going to go through each of these algorithms with you now, but the main thing I want you to take away is if you look at these 2 tasks of spreading a crumpled cloth and folding a flat cloth, there's actually a pretty big gap between the performance of the best deep reinforcement learning algorithm and the performance of what ideally could be achieved. So there's a lot of room for improvement on these tasks. And why is it that deep reinforcement learning methods tend to perform poorly on these tasks? Well, first let's look at how deep reinforcement learning algorithms tend to represent the environment. Typically, given some observation of the environment, these methods would compress that observation to a latent vector and then map that latent vector through a policy to actions that the robot should perform, or they combine that latent vector with a vector representation of the robot action into a latent dynamics model, and then predict the latent vector of the next time step of how the world will change in response to the robot actions. These approaches are called model-free and model-based RL respectively. And one thing you would probably ask, looking at this diagram, is what does this latent vector capture about the observation? And is this latent representation sufficient for my task? Now, it's not always easy to answer that question, but there's one class of methods that we can look into to get a little bit more insight, which is methods that do planning in latent space. So these approaches would start with an image, encode that to a Latent vector, and then given some action sequence, it simulates the effect of the action sequence in latent space. So it uses a latent dynamics model to make latent predictions. Then you can score these latent predictions using a latent reward function. You can repeat this process for different possible action sequences, simulating each one in latent space using the latent dynamics model. And then you can pick the action sequence that has the highest predicted reward. And so here's what happens when you apply this method of planning with latent vector dynamics using a method known as PlanNat. It's a state-of-the-art method that does planning in latent space. And so for the task of pouring water without spilling, here's what this method does. You can see that it actually it gets most of the water into the cup, but it's spilled a bunch of it outside the cup as well. Here I'll circle the droplets that have spilled out in case they're hard to see. But what did this method think was going to happen according to its plan? Here you can see its plan reconstructing the latent vectors for the plan that it selected. And you can see that in its plan, it perfectly poured all of the water into the cup without spilling. And why is this? Well, it makes sense if you think about it, because the droplets that spilled out of the cup are very hard to predict exactly where they're going to be. And they're also very small. They take up a very small number of pixels in the image. So the simplest thing to do is for the latent representation to basically ignore these droplets. They're small and hard to predict, so why not just ignore them? Which is fine, except for our task, which requires you not to spill the water. There's a similar thing that happens for spreading the crumpled cloth. Here you can see it doesn't do a very good job of this task either. But in its plan, it's predicted just this big orange blob. So it's a similar story here. Predicting the exact location of the wrinkles and folds in the cloth is fairly difficult. And the wrinkles and folds take up a small number of pixels in the image. So the easiest thing to do for the model is just to ignore them. So what we see in these examples is that compressing an entire scene or a complex object into a single latent vector can end up losing subtle but important details about that are needed to perform the task. Now, someone looking at this who's a hardcore deep reinforcement learning person would think, well, can't we just use a larger latent vector? And yes, that is true, you can. Archimedes once said, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world. His lesser well-known brother, Archimedes, once said, give me a large enough latent vector and enough computation, and I can memorize any training set. These statements are both technically true, but not terribly practical or useful. And so yes, with a large enough latent vector and enough computation, we could probably get the task shown on the previous slide to work. But we'll see shortly how we can actually learn even more efficiently by encoding some environmental structure into the representation. So stay tuned, and we'll see how we can do a better job on these tasks with some more environmental structure. OK, so the takeaways here are that we have a new benchmark environment known as SoftGem for deformable object manipulation, which allows researchers to easily develop new methods for these tasks. We demonstrate that deformable objects present a large challenge for state-of-the-art deep reinforcement learning methods. And we show the downsides of latent vector representations for deformable objects. So this work then inspired our next project, which is how do we actually get a robot to do cloth smoothing in a reliable way? And in this project, we're going to take the approach of learning a dynamics model. So we want to predict how the cloth will change in response to the robot actions, and then use the dynamics model to plan what actions the robot should take to smooth the crumpled cloth. This project is led by my students, Xingyu and Yufei. So how should we represent this dynamics model for this task? One approach that we just discussed is to learn latent vector dynamics. So compress an image to a latent vector, concatenate the robot action. Through a latent dynamics model, you can predict the next latent vector. But as we already saw, latent vector dynamics models do not encode any environmental structure, which can make generalization to new cloth configurations difficult. An approach that we found works a little bit better is to learn a pixel dynamics model. So given some image of observation of the cloth, these approaches try to encode this image and then predict an image of what the scene will look like after the robot takes a given action. This is an approach that was explored by Ken Goldberg's group at Berkeley, including Daniel Seda, who's now doing a postdoc in my lab. And so the benefit of this approach is that it captures the spatial structure of the scene instead of compressing it into a single latent vector. But the downside is that pixel dynamics might not actually sufficiently capture the underlying physics of the cloth. So our approach instead is going to be to learn a graph dynamics model. So given a point cloud observation of the cloth, we're going to first estimate the cloth mesh. And then we'll pass that estimated mesh through a graph neural network dynamics model, which will predict how the mesh will change in response to a robot action. OK, so why should we use a cloth mesh? Well, why should we use a mesh as our representation? Well, a mesh is a pretty good model of cloth physics. Mesh is often used by the graphics community to model cloth. And that's because a cloth can be modeled by a set of points connected by springs. And the other forces that act on a cloth, such as gravity, collision forces, and friction, can be represented as node or edge potentials on this graph. But there are some challenges to using a mesh representation for a cloth. So first, we see an RGBD observation, which we convert to a voxelized point cloud. But we don't get to see how these points are connected on the underlying cloth mesh. We just see a bunch of points in space, but we don't know how they're connected. Secondly, we can't even see most of the points on the cloth due to self-occlusion. So we can only see the points on the visible surface of the cloth, but we don't see what the points look like underneath that surface. And so how should we handle occlusions? Well, the right thing to do is to estimate a distribution over the full configuration of the cloth, including uncertainty over the occluded regions. This is an approach we're actually exploring now in ongoing work, so stay tuned for that approach. But in this project, we just want to make the following point, which is that a graph dynamics model combined with a very simple approach for handling occlusions still significantly outperforms a pixel dynamics model or latent vector dynamics or model-free policy. And so what is this simple approach for handling occlusions? So our simple approach is as follows. We're going to learn to estimate how the visible points on the cloth are connected. So for example, in this image on the left, we can see that the pair of points connected by this green edge are probably directly connected on the underlying cloth mesh, whereas these pair of points connected by the red edge are probably not directly connected on the underlying cloth mesh. They're just kind of near each other because of the way that the cloth is folded, but they're not actually connected on the underlying mesh. Does everyone see that? Yeah, great. Cool. OK, so then we can create a graph based on the estimated connectivity of all of the visible points. Here's sort of a cartoon illustration of what that might look like for this example, with the different types of edges, green or red, based on whether the edge represents a connection on the underlying cloth mesh or not. And this we call the visible connectivity graph. And then we can learn a dynamics model over this graph of visible points. We call this visible connectivity dynamics. And the dynamics must learn to take into account the partial observability of the cloth. So how does the dynamics model work? Given an observation of the cloth at the first time step, we're going to extract from that a voxelized point cloud. And then we're going to connect all nearby pairs of points by edges. So that forms this initial graph. And then we're going to pass that through an edge prediction GNN, which is going to try to predict which of these edges are actually edges on the underlying cloth mesh. Then we'll input both types of edges into the dynamics GNN. We'll predict how the mesh will deform in the next time step in response to the robot action. We then take that prediction and put it back into our model to plan over the next step. OK, so how does the edge prediction GNN work? So we're going to feed as input this graph in which we've initially connected all nearby points by edges. And then we do the standard graph neural network thing, which is we encode each node and edge into a latent vector, pass messages back and forth between the nodes and the edges. Then we're going to decode the edges, and our final output will be a binary prediction on each edge of whether the edge is an edge on the underlying cloth mesh. So we output a score between 0 and 1 on each edge of whether the edge is on the underlying mesh. Okay, so that's the edge prediction GNN. The next is the dynamics GNN, which takes as input both the graph that all nearby points are connected by edges, as well as the other graph of the estimated mesh edges. And we do the same thing. We're going to encode the graph, pass messages between nodes and edges, and then decode it. And the output of this, the dynamics GNN, will be a predicted acceleration on each node of how that node will move in the next time step in response to the robot actions. Okay, so that's our model. How do we use the model for planning? So in this project, we're focusing on the task of smoothing a crumpled cloth. So what we do is we imagine a sphere on each node in the graph, and then we project all the spheres into a plane and compute the total area of all these projected spheres. And so this basically for smoothing, you want kind of your cloth to be spread out. So you want the total covered area of the cloth to be large. So that's what this reward captures. We're going to plan with pretty much the simplest planning method, which is simple random shooting, which works as follows. We'll sample n pick and place actions. We simulate the effect of each action using our mesh dynamics model. Then we score each action according to the predicted reward. And finally, we choose the action with the highest predicted reward. So this is about the simplest planning method you can come up with, which is fine, because the point of this project, again, is to show that a graph dynamics model combined with a simple approach for occlusions and a simple approach for planning can still outperform pixel dynamics or latent vector dynamics or model-free policy. Okay, we train this method in simulation in SoftGym, which I showed earlier, which uses the NVIDIA Flex simulator. We train our graph dynamics model using 2,000 random pick-and-place actions. The baselines are all trained on at least 100,000 pick-and-place actions. So we give the baselines much more data than we give our own method. And we use the voxelized point cloud as input to the graph dynamics model, which allows us to easily transfer from simulation to the real world, because we voxelize the simulation and the real world in the same way. So the input to our network looks pretty much identical, no matter whether it's coming from the simulator or from the real world. Okay, we train one graph dynamics model with one set of weights in simulation, and we apply that model without any adaptation or fine-tuning on a cotton square cloth, a silk square cloth, and a cotton t-shirt. And here you can see how our model works. So on the left is a video of our method flattening this crumpled cloth. On the bottom right, you can see the mesh that was fit to this cloth and how the mesh, how we predict how the mesh will deform in response to the robot action that we've selected. On the top right, you can see the different actions that we are, some of the different actions that we're considering, visualized as an arrow showing the pick and place points for that action. And the color indicates how good we think that action would be. So green indicates we think that this is a really good action, and red is an action that we think is going to be less good. So you can see that we're able to flatten all these different kinds of cloth, whether it's cotton, silk, square, or a t-shirt. Our model generalizes to all these different configurations. Here's 24 more videos, each showing the cloth in a different configuration. And so I guess in interest of time, I'll just kind of speed through this. But basically, you can see that eventually we're actually able to flatten all the different kinds of cloth reasonably well. Okay. Quantitatively, how does our method compare to previous approaches? So on the y-axis is the normalized improvement. So 0 means we didn't make any change in how flat the cloth is. And 1 means we made the cloth perfectly flat. On the x-axis, we're showing the different number of pick-and-place actions that we allow each method to perform. So first I'm showing the performance of a model-free policy. Next, I'm showing the performance of a latent dynamics model. This is the performance of a pixel dynamics model. And finally, here's a performance of our approach using mesh dynamics. And you can see that we significantly outperform the previous approaches, flattening the cloth in much fewer pick-and-place actions. Now, we train all of these methods on a square cloth, and here we're testing them also on a square cloth. But what if we test them on different kinds of cloths? So this shows the performance of these methods trained on square and tested on rectangular cloth. And here's the methods trained on square and tested on the t-shirt. So you can see that our method is able to generalize much better to novel cloth shapes compared to the pixel dynamics approach, which doesn't really generalize very well to out-of-distribution shapes. Because basically, we're modeling all of these shapes as a graph and sort of learning how the graph deforms. And so that kind of graph deformation generalizes pretty well to different cloth shapes, whereas the image of the cloth is more different based on whether the cloth is a square or a t-shirt. OK, so the main takeaways here are that we learn the visible connectivity dynamics over the visible part of the cloth. And our mesh-based dynamics model better models the cloth physics compared to previous approaches. And using this, we demonstrate zero-shot sim-to-real transfer for cloth smoothing of different materials. So I'll pause here briefly and see if there are any questions about this project. Yeah.
How was the metric calculated earlier? Like you said that there's some kind of like flatness metric. Is that in simulation or is it like a physical?
Yeah, so there's different things. So in terms of our reward function, so our reward function is what we apply in both simulation and the real world, which is we take the nodes of our graph and we put a sphere on each one. Then we project all those spheres into a plane, and we compute the total area of all the projected spheres. So that's what the reward function that we use for planning. Now, how we evaluate how good our performance is kind of the same thing. We basically look at like the total area covered by the cloth. So we assume that we have like cloth segmentation working, and then we look at the total area of the cloth segment, and that's essentially, you can compare that to the initial area, and that's that is sort of, it's normalized so that the initial area is rescaled to 0, and fully flattened gets a score of 1. Sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you described the method as dealing with simple occlusions. Have you guys looked at all whether or not that generalizes to like if there was another cloth, like occlusion by another cloth, or is it just self-occlusions?
Are you talking about the future work or this current approach?
I'm just talking about like trying to understand, I guess, like basically the thing that your method is able to do is figure out what things are connected to each other on the same cloth.
Yeah, right. So basically, I mean, we're using the depth image as input, and then it figures out like what the connectivity, the mesh connectivity is. So how it does it is probably by looking at depth edges and curvature. And so if there was another cloth overlaid with this one, there would probably be a depth edge there as well. And we would probably say that those are disconnected. We don't explicitly reason about like the number of cloths, though, or anything like that. Yeah. Is there a question? Yeah.
So it might be a corner case, but what if the cloth is folded along the center line? Then this will result in like two bimodal dynamic models. How did you consider this problem?
The cloth is folded along the center line. Why do you say bimodal? Because we don't know about because there's ambiguity? Is that what you mean?
You have only one direction to one side to unfold it, right?
Right, yes. OK, so basically that's something that we're exploring in current work. So yeah, current work, we're kind of learning a distribution over the full cloth configurations and then reasoning over that uncertainty. But yeah, so stay tuned. Yeah, cool, yeah.
What's the scale of the number of samples it takes for you to learn the GNN?
Yeah, so that's this. So basically, we train from 2,000 random pick-and-place actions and we give the baselines over 100,000 pick and place actions, and that's all the data that we use to train everything in our system. Cool. Okay, so good questions. Okay, so next I will go on to talk about the next project, which is how do we actually perform cloth folding? This is a project that is led by my students Thomas and Sujay. Okay, so in this task, the task is here going to be defined by a series of sub-goals. So starting from some initial cloth configuration, we're going to provide as input to our system a series of sub-goals that we need to reach in succession in order to fold the cloth a certain way. And so we're going to be learning a goal-conditioned policy that takes as input the current observation of the cloth, as well as the next sub-goal that we're going to try to achieve, and output the robot actions that we want the robot to perform. And we want a policy that can decide whether to use bimanual or single arm manipulation depending on the task. Sometimes for some tasks you need to grasp the cloth with 2 arms, and sometimes it's just 1. Okay, so a common approach that's used in previous work for this kind of task looks like the following. So these approaches would input the observation and goal into a policy and directly output the robot actions. This doesn't work. This works okay, but not so great because it needs to jointly reason about the relationship between the observation and the goal and how the robot needs to move to achieve that goal. A better approach that's been tried in previous work that works a little bit better is to have this kind of policy that inputs the observation and goal and outputs the pick and place points for the robot. This works a little bit better, but still has problems because it still needs to jointly reason about the relationship between the observation and the goal and where the robot needs to grasp the cloth to achieve that goal. Our approach is to separate out first the desired object motion, and then we're going to infer the desired robot actions. So what do I mean? So given observation and a goal, we're going to pass that through something that we call a flow net, which is going to output the correspondences between the observation and the goal in something that we call a flow image. We then input that flow image into a pick net that's going to output the pick and place points of how the robot will achieve these correspondences. Okay, so let's break that down into the different parts. So the first step is to estimate the correspondence between the observation and the goal. So for each point in the observation, we can use a simulator to figure out where the point has moved to in the goal. We can then create this flow image, which shows the movement of every point between the observation and the goal. We're assuming here that the observation and each sub-goal is just one robot action apart. And so this is just showing just where all the points in the observation have moved to in the goal. That's kind of one step away. Okay, so then we can train a flow net that takes as input the observation and the goal and outputs an estimate of all of these correspondences. We use a flow net similar to the kind that's used in optical flow for video analysis, where it's trying to predict where each point in one video frame has moved to in the next video frame. We repurpose it for this task of estimating the correspondences between the observation and the goal. So we can train that in simulation by computing the ground truth flow and use that to train our flow net model. Okay, so given the observation and the goal, we can use FlowNet to output this image of correspondences between the observation and the goal. And next, we input that to PickNet. That's going to output the pick points of where the robot should grasp the cloth. Next, to get the place points, we're not going to output them by a network. We're actually just going to query the flow at the location of the pick points to find the place points. So let's see an example. So suppose this is the observation and the goal, and here is the estimated flow vectors. And now suppose we choose these 2 points as the pick points. So we then just follow these flow vectors to the other end to get the location of the place points. So we're assuming that the subgoal is just one action away, so we can just follow the flow vectors to get the place point locations. Okay, so how do we switch between single arm and dual arm actions? That's pretty easy. If the pick points are within a threshold, then we're going to merge them together into a single point that to form a single pick action for a single arm. The next question is, how do we decide when to progress to the next subgoal? So after you perform some action, there might be some errors. You might need to correct the cloth configuration a little bit before moving on to the next subgoal. So what we do is we compare the current observation to the current subgoal and compute the flow magnitude between these. And we progress to the next subgoal when the average flow magnitude to the current subgoal is less than a given threshold. That means that we've sufficiently achieved the current subgoal and can move on to the next one. We train this in SoftGym and transfer it to the real world. In this case, we're training on 20,000 random pick-and-place actions. And we use depth images, so it's pretty easy to transfer from simulation to the real world. So as a reminder, the big idea of this paper is, instead of previous work that directly outputs robot actions or outputs pick-and-place points, we first output this flow image of correspondences between the observation and the goal, and then we input that to a second network that outputs the robot actions needed to achieve that object motion. So we first compute object motion, then robot motion. OK, and we also take advantage of flow in 3 different ways in this project. The first is explicitly reasoning about the observation and the goal using flow. The second is we determine the place points by querying the flow at the pick points. And the third is we use the flow magnitude to decide when to progress to the next subgoal. So here you can see some videos. On the top left is the final goal, although we actually input to our network a series of subgoals. And you can see the network is able to learn how to fold in the different corners to achieve these first 2 goals. Here's an example where the robot needs to use bimanual manipulation to fold over one of the sides. And so it's able to do that pretty reliably. Here's folding in one of the corners to make a triangle, or folding things at different angles. So I'll just sort of skip to the results. So here on the top row are all of the goals that we are trying to achieve. And the second row is what our robot achieved. And you can see that the goals and the achieved observations match pretty well, although there's still some room for improvement. We trained this just on a square cloth, but we're able to generalize to a rectangular cloth as well. The fact that it's white versus blue doesn't matter because we only see depth as input to our network. But it's able to generalize because it's sort of reasoning about the relationships between the observation and the goal in a way that generalizes. This is similar to flow networks for video analysis have also been shown to generalize pretty well to new videos with new object configurations. So here you can see the goals in the first row and what was achieved for the rectangular cloth, and similarly for the t-shirt. So again, there's still some room for improvement, but compared to previous work, this is pretty significant progress. So on the y-axis, you can see the average particle position error, so lower is better. On the x-axis is the inference time, so further to the left is faster. So you can see that our method is both more accurate and faster than previous work. Qualitatively, here you can see some results in simulation with our output on the left and the goals on the right. So you can see that at least in simulation, we are pretty accurate at achieving each of these goals. So the remaining errors are probably caused by a sim-to-real gap that we're currently looking to address with different approaches. And here you can see qualitatively on the right the output of a previous approach. And you can see that it does a much worse job of performing each of these folds. So it's not just in the numbers. You can see that qualitatively there's a difference between our approach and the previous approaches. OK, so the takeaway of this section is that we have a novel flow-based approach for bimanual goal-conditioned cloth manipulation, in which we explicitly reason about the desired object motion, and then for the robot motion. And this allows us to perform successful cloth folding in the real world. OK, so let's see. OK, there might be time for me to try to squeeze in one more project, so I'll do that. So the next maybe project I'll try to squeeze in is about cloth grasping. In this project, we're going to try to grasp the true edge or corner of the cloth. and differentiate that from wrinkles and folds in the cloth. And so previous work approached this by manipulating the cloth into a configuration from which perception is easy, and then folding the cloth. But that's fairly slow. We want to figure out how can we model the cloth to enable both fast and accurate manipulation. So our approach is the following. We're going to take it as input a depth image to a segmentation network, and we're going to try to output the location of the corners and edges of the cloth. And we're going to train this by coloring the cloth with paint or tape. Our network doesn't see these colors. It only sees as input the depth, but this provides us a ground truth for the corner and edge information. Now, one question that you would have, though, is even if you know where an edge is, what direction should you grasp the cloth to grasp the edge? So we're going to perform these kind of angle sliding grasps. And so you need to know, should I approach the edge from this direction or from that direction? So to answer that question, we basically apply this trick again. And now we're going to label the interior edges in green. And so now you can look at the direction from the exterior to the interior edge to figure out how to grasp it. So suppose here's an example segmentation output. Blue is the estimated corners, yellow are the estimated outer edges, and green are the estimated inner edges. And let's zoom in on this part. So where should we grasp the cloth? We should grasp it at an outer edge. What direction should we grasp it? Well, we should grasp it from the direction from the outer edge to the inner edge. But what about the places where there's some ambiguity, like here, these yellow parts that there's an inner edge nearby, which comes from a different part of the cloth. So in response to that, we're going to reason about the directional variation in the neighborhood. So at this point, there's inner edges in many different directions. So there's high uncertainty there. Whereas from this point, there's an inner edge only in one direction. So we're going to compute this edge directional uncertainty. And then we can take that into account when figuring out how to grasp the cloth. We train on just 8 minutes of video that looks like this of the cloth in different configurations. And here you can see the results. So we segment the cloth, find the corners, edges, interior edges, reason about grasp directions and directional uncertainty. And now we're able to grasp the cloth corners and edges from different crumpled configurations. So it's able to generalize pretty well to different cloth configurations, distinguishing the true edges and corners from wrinkles and folds in the cloth. And so this is actually the project that inspired our later project to think that we could actually reason about where the edges are in the cloth from this depth sensor. Here you can see that it generalizes to different cloth sizes and textures. Textures don't matter because we use depth as input. OK, so basically we show also that if we ignore the direction of the edge or the directional uncertainty from which we should approach the edge for grasping, then we do much worse. So basically our method distinguishes true cloth edges from folds, and we selectively grasp based on estimated directional uncertainty to achieve robust grasping of a crumpled cloth. OK, so sorry, let me jump forward now. OK, so what are some takeaways of these different projects? How do we actually bridge the gap between perception and planning? So in the first project, we use a graph to reason about the relationship between different object parts. In the second project, we reason explicitly about the relationship between the current state and the goal. And then in the third project, we reason about the relationship between the outer and the inner edge. So the main thing that combines all of these is reasoning about relationships. Relationships, I think, don't get a lot of attention in machine learning, but I think that they're actually very important for learning to perform manipulation tasks. OK, and so where are we going in the future? I'm interested in representation learning for deformable object manipulation. So here's some examples of different deformable object manipulation tasks that we're looking to work on either currently or in the future. And what's involved in this? The first is reasoning about object interactions. So reasoning about, say, multi-object tasks like screwing a lid on a jar, tools, so interactions between the tool and the object, and extrinsic dexterity, which is reasoning about the relationship between the object and the external environment. So these all involve reasoning about relationships between multiple things. Also reasoning about heterogeneous materials, so mixtures of liquids and solids, peeling, which is reasoning about layers of an object, the peel versus the interior, and articulated objects, which requires reasoning about the different object parts. And finally, how do we do long horizon reasoning for deformable object manipulation? There's already a lot of work out there in long horizon reasoning in general, but since deformable objects require new representations, how do we reason over long horizons on top of those representations? Here you can see some other projects that unfortunately I didn't have time to talk about all of them. So on the top right, we're learning how to slide along the edge of a cloth with tactile sensing. In the bottom center, we're learning how to grasp transparent and reflective objects. And on the bottom right, we're learning how to pour transparent liquids into transparent cups using unsupervised image translation. So you can feel free to ask me later about any of these projects. I'd be happy to talk more about them. These projects were led by my fabulous students, Xingyu Yufei, Thomas, Wenchuan, Aurora, and Gautam. Another direction that I unfortunately didn't have time to talk about today, but you can ask me about later, is self-supervised learning for autonomous driving. So given large autonomous driving data sets, which are pretty easy to collect, can we avoid the need for human labeling and just learn directly from large amounts of unlabeled autonomous driving data? I've applied this idea to different perception problems in the autonomous driving domain and published in various computer vision conferences. Another direction that we've explored is active perception with light currents, which are a new sensor developed by another faculty at CMU that we're collaborating with, where you have to choose where to sense, and then you can use the sense, and so you have to figure out where do you want to actually sense. These projects were supported by collaborations with Honda as well as the ARIO CMU AI Center, and led by my fabulous students, Hamagi, Janren, Peiyun, and Sid. So I'd finally like to acknowledge all of the terrific students that I had the pleasure of working with, as well as my generous sponsors. And finally, I'll end here and take any remaining questions that you might have.
Any questions? Can I ask a question? So is the depth camera pretty much at the same spot? Like where is it sort of directly above the cloth and kind of looking down?
Yeah, that's right.
So imagine it was more of a mobile manipulation scenario where the robot itself had to have the sensor and there might be more sort of variation in the scene, how far things were away, maybe how things were positioned.
Right.
How would the approach kind of generalize to a more in the wild sort of setting?
That's a good question. So there's a few things I could say. One is that one big advantage of depth as opposed to RGB images is that you know the 3D configuration. So even if your depth camera is at an angle, you can take the 3D points and rotate them so that you imagine that you're always looking at them from a top-down view. The occlusions will be a little bit different. So you might need to train the method to be robust to different kinds of occlusions. But I guess also if you're very far away, the resolution of the sensor might not be good enough to pick up on some of the fine details in the cloth, but you probably can't manipulate it until you're close anyway, so maybe that's not such a problem. Those are some immediate things that come to mind.
Sure. Hi, here.
Thank you, David, for the great talk and
Sure.
great demos.
Thanks.
And I'm curious, like for the close smoothing, like it's just one-step planning, and also for the close folding, you also have sub goals for the robots to follow. Are there any concrete steps or plans in your head on how to really do long horizon like planning using various models?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's a pretty big open challenge, but I can tell you about some ideas that we're thinking about. So I guess the main approach we're pursuing at the moment is co-location planning. So basically, given the initial observation and a goal, we can jointly plan over intermediate states and actions to try to find a sequence of states and actions that can get you from the start to the goal. the main question here is what space should we do collocation planning in, right? So we've been representing cloths as a particle-based dynamics model, and I think planning over the state of the position of all the particles is probably too high dimensional, so we need some lower dimensional representation to plan in. Lower dimensional representations are not necessarily good for cloth manipulation because they lose a lot of details, but maybe we can find a lower dimensional representation that's good enough for long horizon planning. Yeah, that's the approach that we're pursuing at the moment. Yeah, great question.
More questions? How about other types of garments, like not simply like, as the cloths get more complicated, maybe zippers, buttons, and different things like sleeves. Have you thought about like how would you generalize to more complex kind of? I know how hard this is. I'm not.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So there's a few things that we're thinking about there. So first, if there's sort of a set of known garment categories, then we can work with that. So say we have, tops, pants, skirts, dresses, jumpsuits, I forget, jackets. There's a few categories that we're currently working with, and we can sort of train on those categories. And if you're trying to do occlusion reasoning and you see a shirt, but you only see one of the sleeves, you can assume that probably the other sleeve is like tucked underneath the shirt. If you're trying to generalize to arbitrary fabric configurations, maybe there's some funky, shirt that only has one sleeve or something. So that's gonna create some ambiguities and challenges for an approach that's trying to do occlusion reasoning. But since we have interactive perception, maybe we can check if there's a sleeve, and then if we don't see it, override our prior on what this was supposed to look like. In terms of zippers and buttons, I guess, that's sort of that's sort of an interesting place for graph dynamics because in some sense, like a zipper is something that changes where the edges are in the cloth. So there might be two parts that were previously disconnected, but after you zip it, now they are connected. So we kind of have to reason about how these different actions can affect the sort of the configuration of the graph. Yeah, great question.
Cool. Anyone else? One last question? Yes, Nicole?
So you mentioned for training that you used 2,000 pick and place samples for your model,
right,
and over 100,000 for the baseline. And
right,
it was something similar for the second project you mentioned. What motivated the difference in number of samples for the baseline versus yours?
Great question. So basically, we first had our approach, which we got running with 2,000 examples. We kind of had done some small experiments with other approaches, and we're kind of convinced that they weren't really the right approach. But then when we actually had to do the full evaluation, we looked in those papers and saw that they had trained on over 100,000 pick and place actions. So then, someone might complain that we're using the methods in a different way from how they were intended to be used. So then we train them on however much data they trained on in those papers. That was kind of how that ended up. It would be interesting to see what would happen if we trained our method on 100,000 actions. It probably would be a little bit better.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, it's pretty much just after 4, so what if we thank David again? Thank you for a wonderful talk, very cool.
Sure, yeah, thank you.